I'm Diane Macedo. Today on ABC News Live, former President Trump says he will not oppose the release of the search warrant for Mar-a-Lago after the Justice Department filed for it to be unsealed. We have more on when we could see that warrant and what it might tell us about what those agents were looking for and what they found. The House of Representatives is set to pass President Biden's signature climate and health care legislation. It's the most significant federal climate change legislation in a generation. We'll break down what it means for you and your family. But we begin with the Justice Department poised to release that Mar-a-Lago search warrant after former President Trump announced he will not fight to keep it sealed. Sources tell ABC News part of the information investigators were looking for included material labeled special access, which is accessible only by the highest level security clearances. The Washington Post is reporting some of the documents sought were related to nuclear weapons. But today, Republican legislators from the House Intelligence Committee are questioning the raid itself and tactics used by the FBI.
House Republicans are committed to immediate oversight, accountability, and a fulsome investigation to provide needed transparency and answers to the American people regarding Joe Biden and his administration's weaponization of the Department of Justice and FBI against Joe Biden's political opponent.
Those leaders are now calling for, quote, clear and full transparency in this matter. ABC News Chief Washington correspondent Jonathan Karl has the latest.
Just hours after the Justice Department filed for the Mar-a-Lago search warrant to be unsealed, Trump announced he would not oppose the release. The former president issuing a statement saying he was, quote, encouraging the immediate release of those documents, although his lawyers already have them and could have already released them if he wanted. This is the Washington Post is reporting that among the information sought by federal agents at Mar-a-Lago were classified documents related to nuclear weapons. Perhaps the most telling detail in the DOJ filing on unsealing the warrant was who signed it, the chief of the counterintelligence section of the DOJ National Security Division, a clear indication the investigation is related to classified information with national security implications. Sources tell ABC News that investigators were also looking for material labeled, quote, special access, which is only available to a limited number of individuals with the highest level of security clearance. Under intense pressure to explain the FBI's operation at Mar-a-Lago, Attorney General Garland Thursday took the rare step of publicly commenting on an ongoing investigation.
I personally approved the decision to seek a search warrant in this matter. Second, the department does not take such a decision lightly.
In fact, ABC News has learned Trump was subpoenaed for the documents earlier this year, as DOJ attempted to get him to turn them over without a search warrant. Afterwards, a small team of FBI agents visited Mar-a-Lago in early June, meeting with Trump's lawyers about the missing White House documents. The execution of the search warrant on Monday came only after DOJ concluded Trump still had not turned over everything demanded by the subpoena.
Where possible, it is standard practice to seek less intrusive means as an alternative to a search and to narrowly scope any search that is undertaken.
Amid concern about increased threats to law enforcement officials, Garland also addressed harsh criticism of the FBI, some of it coming from prominent Republicans who have accused federal agents of going after Trump for political reasons.
I will not stand by silently when their integrity is unfairly attacked. The men and women of the FBI and the Justice Department are dedicated, patriotic public servants. Every day, they protect the American people from violent crime, terrorism, and other threats to their safety while safeguarding our civil rights.
Sources tell ABC News that some of the material sought by federal agents was so sensitive that it was believed by authorities that they needed to take possession of it immediately. Diane?
All right, Jonathan Karl, thanks for that. And we're learning some new details now about the armed man who allegedly tried to break into an FBI office in Cincinnati. Authorities say the man who was killed by police is a, quote, suspected domestic violent extremist, possibly motivated by conspiracy theories related to the former president, the 2020 election, and that Mar-a-Lago search. Trevor Alt has the latest from Cincinnati.
New details about the suspect who authorities say tried to break into an FBI field office in Cincinnati, leading officers on a miles-long chase that ended in a deadly shootout. Multiple law enforcement sources tell ABC News the suspect is 42-year-old Ricky Schiffer, labeling him a suspected domestic violent extremist.
Male subject attempted to gain entry into the FBI field office in Cincinnati.
Authorities are investigating social media posts allegedly made by Schiffer after he learned about the FBI search on Mar-a-Lago. He called for war and to kill FBI agents on site. In posts on Twitter and former President Trump's own social media network, Truth Social. Just after 9 Thursday morning, officials say he tried to breach the FBI office's visitor screening facility with a nail gun, body armor, and an AR-15.
He was armed. He was unsuccessful and he fled that area.
Schiffer then taking off, leading authorities down the highway for 60 miles.
They're following a car for the FBI, so there were about 7 units, I believe, on the car.
They say he fired at officers from his vehicle, eventually stopping in a cornfield and trading gunfire.
Officers attempted to negotiate with the suspect. Over time, they eventually failed and were unsuccessful. So at that time, officers tried to move in using less lethal tactics. The suspect then raised the firearm toward law enforcement, and that's when shots were fired at the suspect.
And now new details are emerging about his past. Analysts say social media posts place him at the Capitol on January 6th. Investigators are now trying to determine if he was there during the insurrection and if he has any connection to the Proud Boys. He had not been charged with crimes in connection to the January 6th attack. And Diane, there were many warning signs this could happen and could continue to happen. Law enforcement has been on high alert since the Mar-a-Lago search, monitoring growing anger online and many posts, just like the ones the suspect is believed to have shared, calling for violence or even civil war. Diane?
All right, Trevor Ault, thanks for that. And let's bring in senior investigative reporter Aaron Katursky, along with ABC News contributor and former FBI agent Brad Garrett and attorney Jeffrey Robbins for more on this. Brad, how concerned are you that there could be copycat attacks on FBI agents or offices after this standoff, but particularly with the Justice Department now poised to release the Mar-a-Lago search warrant?
I'm really concerned. If you look at this shooting yesterday, it's a great example of a desperate person, a poor plan, goes into a highly secure area against probably hundreds of agents, some heavily armed, and then flees. So really, it doesn't really take planning. So are there people out there similar to this guy? The answer is, of course, and they're looking for some justification to launch an attack, in this case against FBI agents. So if I were still active, I'd be very concerned and aware as I moved around.
Now, Aaron, Republicans want to know how the FBI got the information that led to the search warrant, suggesting that there may have even been an informant close to former President Trump. What do we know about that?
We know, Diane, that the authorities had been interviewing different associates of the former president, people who worked with him in the White House, and they developed information about this classified material that they sought during the search on Monday. They had subpoenaed this material earlier in the spring and visited the president's estate back in June. But whatever the president did to comply with that subpoena apparently wasn't enough, and they took the more invasive step on Monday because they were so concerned about some of this stuff with its national security implications. We've learned that they wanted to get it back right away.
Now, Jeff, former President Trump says he will not oppose the release of this search warrant. So when do we get to see it, and what will it tell us?
Well, he says he doesn't oppose it. He calls on the Department of Justice to release it. Why don't we just shortcut this and have him press send and send it to all of us, because he's got it right now. I don't know what he's waiting for. I don't know what he's been waiting for since Monday. He can do it right now. We don't actually need to wait for the magistrate to rule on the motion to unseal file the Department of Justice. If the former president actually wants us to see the warrant and see the materials associated with the warrant, he can just send them to us right now. You know, every time you think you have seen the lowest level of mendacity from these people, there we are shown that there's actually a lower level. The attacks on the FBI and law enforcement that we have seen are just horrific, as anybody who's ever had the privilege of working with these brave men and women can tell you.
But Jeff, legally, you know, assuming the president's not going to release it himself, the former president, which it looks like he's not, how long could we wait before the Justice Department is able to release it?
Well, the Department of Justice has asked the court to release it. It says it's subject to the objection of the former president. The former president is calling for the documents to be released. My hope is that his attorneys, if that's actually what he wants to have happen, will promptly file a document with the court saying, we agree, we think it should be unsealed, at which point you would imagine that the magistrate would say, okay, the Department of Justice thinks it should be unsealed. The object, let's say, of the search warrant says it should be unsealed. Let's unseal it. Failing any other reason why the two parties' agreement on this shouldn't be adhered to, you would expect to see the documents released today.
Now, Brad, Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee say that the FBI didn't have to use a search warrant here and had other options to get this classified material that they wanted. So what options does the FBI have in a situation like this? And what do you make of the fact that they chose to take this step?
Well, because they had taken other steps, a number of them. Here's how it runs. Unless you have some exigent circumstance, something's going to get destroyed, you go to the person's attorney and you ask them voluntarily to turn over. That didn't work. They go to a subpoena, which is next, which is a command, but it's not a search, it's not an arrest, anything like that. And they didn't comply with that. So finally, they go to a search warrant because they have no other option. I'm sure they spelled that out to the judge. We've tried less intrusive approaches, and he didn't comply to them. So that's why you ended up with a search warrant. They had amazing patience, in my view, considering the apparent sensitivity of what they were going after.
Now, Aaron, the investigation continues even as this battle over the search warrant release plays out. So what are the next steps here?
Well, I think the FBI wants its material back, or wants whatever material it is back in the safe custody of the National Archives or wherever it belongs. And so if they've got everything that they expected to get, well, then the only decision then would be to charge former President Trump with a crime over his handling or mishandling of classified material. And if the search warrant records are released, we may get a sense of the underlying crime that the FBI suspects occurred. That does not, however, mean that the former president would necessarily be charged with mishandling classified material. A conviction on that charge, by the way, comes with a 3-year prison sentence. So there are a number of different decisions that the Justice Department has yet to make. And you heard Attorney General Merrick Garland said in this particular case, given who's involved and what's involved, he takes nothing lightly.
So, Jeff, do you think we could see charges filed against the former president? And if so, how would that work?
Well, you know, we talk about mishandling, and that seems to be an excessively polite way, based on what we now know, to look at this. Mishandling might be putting something in the wrong banker's box. Mishandling might be putting something in the wrong manila folder. This doesn't look like mishandling. It looks like the deliberate, repeated withholding of classified information, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and then the hiding of that classified information, which, if the reporting is correct, includes nuclear-related documents. So we may have a serious problem here in the form of somebody who has deliberately disobeyed the law, if that's what the evidence shows.
All right, Jeffrey Robbins, Brad Garrett, Aaron Katersky, thank you all. And the fight against climate change has reached Capitol Hill. The House of Representatives is set to pass President Biden's signature climate and health care legislation. It's the most significant federal climate change legislation in a generation. We have team coverage of the vote today, throughout the day, and a look ahead now with ABC News business reporter Alexis Christoforous and ABC News' Zohreen Shah from Washington, D.C. Zohreen, the White House press secretary won't say if the entire Democratic caucus in the House will support this bill. So what are its chances of passing the House?
I thought that was an interesting exchange this morning. She was asked multiple times, and yet she wouldn't say if it would pass or not. I mean, look, you have the Senate who just passed the Inflation Reduction Act this Sunday. It barely passed. It was a 50-50 vote, and then the vice president had to break that tie, and it was after a 16-hour vote-a-rama, as they call it, and Dems still didn't get everything that they wanted in it. They wanted that $35 insulin cap that some Republicans also wanted and joined them on. But look, all in all, we still don't know if it's going to pass today. It looks very likely. The president definitely wants wants it to pass. The press secretary wouldn't give comment as to whether she thought it would or not, or if they had enough votes. Maybe she'd want to jinx herself, but we'll just have to see what happens the next few hours.
Now, Alexis, they're calling this the Inflation Reduction Act, but this bill is really focused on climate and health care. So how does reducing inflation come into play?
Yeah, I know they're calling it that, but a lot of economists believe that that is a misnomer for this piece of legislation. It's roughly $700 billion, this overall package. It will work to reduce our country's deficit, so that's good news in the long term. But in terms of the big drivers of inflation right now, energy and food, this does little to nothing to actually help. We're not going to see immediate relief at the grocery store, at the gas pump. Rents will not go down because of this legislation. So, you know, a number of people, including the Congressional Budget Office, which is an independent panel of economists, looked at this package, and they too believe that it will have minimal impact, probably a very small impact on rising prices over the course of time.
So what about when you look long term? Does it look, what economic impact is this expected to have?
So you mentioned energy and healthcare. Let's tackle healthcare, because that's probably the area where Americans are going to feel the most immediate impact. But even that's not super immediate. They're going to be capping Medicare premiums at $2,000. That's going to be at least a couple of years. The government will be able to finally work with the prescription drug companies to lower prices and negotiate those prices. Again, that's not even going to start to happen for the next 3 to 4 years. On the climate issue, they weaved it in through electric vehicles. So there are going to be some tax credits there for Americans, $7,500. If you read the fine print, a number of EV cars available in this country right now will not meet the eligibility. So I think, you know, overall, broad-based, it sounds good, but when you really dig down, it will have minimal impact.
And how are these initiatives being paid for?
Exactly. So higher taxes on a number of large corporations and the wealthy. They're bringing on 87,000 new IRS staffers to make sure there's no tax avoidance going on. But Republicans are beating back, saying that's overreach by the government, and that all Americans of all income levels could now be subject to more intrusive audits by the government.
So, Reen, what's the reaction this act is getting from both sides of the aisle in Washington?
I think right now it's just unclear if they have every den that they need, every person that they need to pass this, right? It's going to be incredibly close here. And the reaction from the Dems, I think they know how badly the president wants to pass this before the midterms. There's about 80-something days left. But as you heard Alexis say, I mean, look, this is something that's going to happen over time, over 3 to 4 years when you read the fine print. But Biden's poll numbers right now, about 37% across the country. And then when you specifically look at inflation, I mean, remember, this is called the Inflation Reduction Act. His poll numbers are far lower. So, you know, the midterms are just, 80-something days away. I think the Dems really want to get this passed, and we'll see if it happens.
All right, Doreen Shah, Alexis Christoforous, we appreciate it. Thank you both. And we have some breaking news now. The Associated Press is reporting author Salman Rushdie has been attacked on stage at an event in New York. His writing led to death threats from Iran in the 1980s. There's no word on his condition, but we will continue to follow this developing story. Coming up, the latest on the Flint water crisis after a judge declared a mistrial when jurors said they couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. Stay with us. Welcome back. A judge has declared a mistrial after jurors said they could not reach a unanimous verdict in a dispute over whether 2 engineering firms should bear some responsibility for Flint's lead-contaminated water. The 2 firms were accused of not doing enough to get Flint, Michigan to treat the highly corrosive water or to urge a return to the regional water supply they had used previously. Joining us now with her legal insight, host and legal analyst of the Law and Crime Network, Terry Austin, is here. Terry, this 8-person jury met for about 7 days after hearing evidence for months. This trial focused on the actions of these 2 firms and the effects of lead on children. So what does this mistrial mean for future legal action on this issue?
Diane, it's going to be very difficult for other plaintiffs to sue these types of engineering companies. I think the jury had a difficult time because they think the government was responsible. And both of these defendants basically said they came in midstream, they were following orders, and basically pointed the finger elsewhere. And that actually worked. And so they said they tried to warn the government to test the water. And I think that jury had a hard time after all of these years saying that these 2 engineering companies were the ones who were responsible. They sent a note to the judge saying they could not reach a verdict. The judge basically said, go back, do your best. And then they finally came out and said, it's going to be very stressful for us and we cannot reach a verdict. So now we have this mistrial in this bellwether case.
Water became contaminated in 2014 after they changed the water supply. They pulled it from the Flint River, and that water wasn't treated to reduce the corrosive effect on the lead pipes. Now, the Michigan Civil Rights Commission is saying that the bad water was the result of systemic racism in the city. So could it change things legally if prosecutors try to bring this case back and argue that race was a factor?
Well, you know, that Michigan Civil Rights Commission report back in 2017, it was 129 pages, and it will be helpful to support any sort of claims that any plaintiffs or any prosecutors might want to bring in this case, whether it's civil or whether it's criminal. And the commission basically said there was systemic racism, there was implicit bias, and they said there were no specific laws that were broken, but that sort of report is definitely going to help anyone who wants to bring a civil rights claim saying that their rights were violated, and it very well could support a verdict in their favor. So I definitely think it was good that the Michigan Civil Rights Commission investigated and came to a conclusion, even though it didn't help in this particular case against these two defendants.
What kind of precedent could this case set for other U.S. cities like Newark, New Jersey, that have since faced their own water crises?
Well, that's exactly right. It does seem like Flint, Michigan has had this crisis going on longer than any other cities who have had contaminated water, but have been able to address it. I think the story here is the fact that you have to move, and you have to move quickly if you want to bring these types of claims.
All right, Terry Austin, thank you as always.
Thank you, Diane.
Coming up, the new CDC guidance on COVID-19 as more students head back to the classrooms. We'll be right back. Welcome back to ABC News Live. The CDC is easing some COVID-19 guidance as students head back to school. If you've been exposed to COVID, you no longer need to quarantine at home. But if you're not vaccinated, the CDC does recommend wearing a mask for 10 days and testing on day 5. The CDC also now says that if you have COVID, you should take a rapid test 5 days into isolation if you've been fever-free for 24 hours and symptoms are resolving. Now, if that test is negative, you can test negative again 48 hours later, and if so, you leave isolation without a mask. CDC also says children won't need to keep testing to stay in school, even if they've been exposed. And the Field of Dreams game returned to Dyersville, Iowa, starting with a Hollywood moment. Baseball players Ken Griffey Jr. and Sr. emerged from the corn to have a catch on the field, built right next to where the iconic movie was filmed. The Cubs played the Reds, taking the lead in the first inning and never looking back. They ended the night with fireworks, and despite the loss, the Reds manager called the experience just perfect. I'm Diane Macedo. Do stay with us as ABC News Live continues with more news, context, and analysis.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.